Hello, this is Arthur Malman, your host, and I'd like to welcome you again to GGG Insights. This summer, we're having a series of interviews with local people in East Hampton to discuss the future of East Hampton, what the major problems are for the next 5, 10, 20 years. We hope to have a real cross-section of people, some in government, the clergy, probably a couple of high school students, people from farming, business, and other backgrounds. I think you got the idea. And today we're very fortunate to have Judith Hope, who, among many other things, has been a past supervisor for the town of East Hampton and at the head of the New York State Democratic Committee. And Judith, why don't you give us some of the background? How'd you get involved in all this stuff, and what are you doing now? I mean, you're not retired. You never retire.
That's a very long story, Arthur. I came out here as a young wife and a young mother in 1967. Well, I came out here the first time during the summer months, as many young people do. Mm-hmm. I took one look at East Hampton town and said, this is the place where I want to spend my life. Mm-hmm. I've never regretted that decision. Raised my kids here. They're still here. They'll never leave. And it wasn't very long before I became politically active, first through the environmental movement, mm-hmm. and then through the women's movement. So those two things converged at a moment in time that propelled me into local politics. Mm-hmm. A group of us who were like-minded mm-hmm. Were concerned that East Hampton was a one-party town and had been for generations. I won't say it was a Republican town, it was more like a Tory town. I think they still pledged allegiance to the King of England, as a matter of fact, or it seemed that way to many of us. But we decided it would be a healthy thing to have two political parties in East Hampton town, so we started a new party, an opposition party. And we did a lot of research, and we discovered that the town was zoned to accommodate something like 670,000 population. It was a staggering number. It would be like the island of Manhattan, mm-hmm. or maybe Miami Beach. And then we started looking very closely at the laws on the local books about protecting wetlands and estuaries, and found that they were not sufficient to do the job that we thought a town like East Hampton deserved. So I ended up becoming chair of the local town Democratic Committee, mm-hmm. but it was very difficult to find candidates because no one wanted to run on the ticket that my party represented. This party had been out of power forever, mm-hmm. and had only elected one town supervisor sometime in 1938, I think it was. So we put together a wonderful ticket, actually, and in fact we recruited to move here from Southampton a candidate for town supervisor by the name of Bill Burke, who mm-hmm. happened to be now, in retrospect, he was the father-in-law of former Congressman Tim Bishop, okay. Kathy Burke's dad.
Oh, okay.
But he didn't live in the
genealogy.
Yeah,
I'm pretty friendly with
Kathy.
Kathy.
He didn't live in the town, so we had to actually move him overnight into East Hampton town. Well, a week after we did that, and we carried petitions, and we got him qualified to run, but in a very short period of time, suddenly he got offered the job of his dreams at Southampton College. Oh, okay. So he quickly moved back to Southampton, and we lost our candidate at the very last moment. So we had a crisis. Mm-hmm. Here we had a ticket with no head of the ticket, mm-hmm. and we were actually, the three of us were in Albany lobbying for Peconic County, and we're in the taxi cab, and we're lamenting this situation of what are we going to do, and my girlfriend said, well, Judith, you're just going to have to run. Mm-hmm. And the fellow who was with us, who was one of the troika, the three of us, said she can't do that. She can't run for supervisor. And my friend said, why not? And he said, well, she's a woman. She'll never be elected. It's a crazy idea.
And you said, of course.
and I thought, well, wait a minute. Mm-hmm. You know, I think I will run. Mm-hmm. So that's how I ended up becoming the candidate. It's a sort of an accidental candidate. But it turned out to be a terrific experience, a wonderful experience. I won, much to my amazement and everybody else's amazement. The day after the election, I went down to the coffee shop called Eddie's Luncheonette, and I was having a cup of coffee, and there were a couple of Bonikers, old Bonikers behind me talking, and one of them said to the other one, "Did you see where that woman from Arkansas got herself elected town supervisor?" And the other one said, "Yeah, town's been around for 300 years. We've survived a lot. I figure we'll survive her as well."
Well, I think the town has survived pretty well, especially under your leadership. You've had the experience of being heavily involved in local politics and local government, and obviously you've had time to step back and try to think of what some of the really major problems, challenges, if you will, that face the town going forward. I just wondered what your outlook was. What should we be focusing on that we're not focusing enough energy on?
Yeah, I don't envy the town officials, their set of challenges these days. They're dealing with very complex issues, many of them big, broad brush, huge issues like climate change and rising sea levels, which will have a profound impact
On everything.
and on everything that, on all of East Hampton Town, certainly on Montauk, but on all of East Hampton Town. And it's within sight. And I think we're fortunate to have a town board that's actually looking seriously at that threat, that challenge, and planning ahead to deal with it in a way that will be as painless as possible. Of course, there will be a lot of pain involved. The second huge issue is renewable energy, with this controversy over the offshore wind energy, which I think is a wonderful opportunity for the town to be a leader, an environmental leader, as we have been for decades. I'm dismayed that it's become a political wedge issue for, I think, largely political reasons now, more recently. I know the fishing community has valid complaints and concerns, and I think they need to be addressed, and I do actually believe the fishing community should be compensated if that's what's necessary to get this done.
One of the things that we had a panel discussion on.
I was there.
Oh, okay.
It was terrific.
And, well, thank you. And there were two takeaways that we thought were important. One was, I guess I have a personal loathing for secrecy, and we've been sort of bounced back and forth as to who will not make public the power purchase agreement. In my other background, I'm a lawyer. I've worked on solar plants. I've worked on one in Middlesex with a power purchase agreement and all that kind of stuff. I know what's in there. And believe me, the Russians don't want to get that information. It's not useful to them. But it probably is useful to some citizens, even if they don't use it and make a change in the WIN program. The idea that there's this black curtain is
as I understand,
ridiculous.
it's PSEG. I understand it's a standard clause in all of their contracts with their providers that the company will not disclose that agreement. So everybody's blamed Deep Wind, and I don't think Deep Wind has any options in this regard.
I think what happened was we went down that road. We found a letter from PSE&G to somebody locally, which said it implied that Deepwater wouldn't make the information public. And then we found out from Deepwater that they had no problem making the information public. So you've got this ghost up there.
Well, I have found
everybody.
the company, Deepwater, to be extraordinarily open, and the number of hearings on this has been
enormous.
I mean, there have been like 12 or 15 public hearings. They've been forthcoming about all the information that they have, it seems to me. So I think in terms of corporate America behavior, they certainly beat Exxon and Valdez. Okay,
well, it's funny.
I hate to use that example.
Well, it's funny. It's funny you mention that. In my other life, we represented all the Native American tribes around Prince William Sound after Exxon Valdez, and what Exxon didn't get any credit for, and this was not our doing, but the press is doing, is within a week after the Exxon Valdez ran aground, Exxon had probably 20 or 30 Exxon officers with checkbooks up in around Prince William Sound. And if you were a fisherman and you came in, they would write you a check. And the check would be for the carrying costs, the mortgage payment on your boat, your lost profit, so forth, without too many questions asked. And the people who receive the checks always, obviously there's somebody who may have a problem with it, but 99% were very happy with those checks. The only thing Exxon did was, it didn't ask them not to bring a claim against Exxon. It asked them if and when they got an award from an Exxon lawsuit to give Exxon a credit for the check they already wrote. So what we learned in that was the other takeaway from Deepwater Wind, and that is a little guy, a fisherman, if he's or she is against a large company, unless the large company takes a very long and good view, is probably not going to succeed in their claim. And so what we've asked over and over again Deepwater to do is set up a fund so that if my net gets caught on one of their pylons, I don't have to go back and start from scratch. And they always have said very quickly, well, there are other people who might be liable, they have to be at the table, and we want to solve this in a business-to-business basis. And I'm thinking of the guy with the little fishing boat up against Deepwater Wind, their backers, and this is like, David and Goliath, and you take away the slingshot. So I mean,
yeah, but Arthur, you can't lose sight of the forest for the trees. I mean, there are huge issues here. Global warming is very real. We're continuing to pollute and destroy the planet, burning fossil fuels. Mm-hmm. And here we have an opportunity to do something positive with renewable energy. Yes, the fishing industry should be protected, but let's not, we're about to kill this deal because...
I'm all in favor of Deepwater Wind as one of the ways to solve our energy problem. But I just think we've got to be careful that this really good company that's trying to develop Deepwater Wind doesn't overlook the practical problems that a little guy may have when they try to seek redress.
If I may, let me quickly go to some of the less global challenges that I think the town faces. We are currently at 90% build out in East Hampton town, which means basically we're just about to reach saturation point. You can't tell that from that trade parade you see every morning. You would think that no one has developed anything out here. And I'm dismayed at the continuing development of these large scale houses, oversized houses, much too large, spec houses, and I think there's a good deal of overbuilding going on, particularly in Southampton town, less so in East Hampton town, but certainly on the East End. It's called greed, G-R-E-E-D. It's old-fashioned. It's been with us for a very long time. But the problem with us reaching nearing the end of available buildable residential land is that the pressure on our zoning boards of appeal, both in the village of East Hampton and the town of East Hampton, and the pressure on our planning boards is going to become very intense to relax the environmental standards that we've all fought very hard to achieve. It was not an easy thing to get these environmental standards enacted. I presided over two of the major rezonings in this town in the early 1970s and again in the early 1980s, which were designed, although we couldn't say so in part, to try to control population growth, because the ultimate population will affect the quality of life of all of us, obviously. I had death threats during the public hearings. They were brutal, the public hearings were. There was tremendous public opposition from certain quarters. So these are hard-won gains, and they're easily lost at the ZBA level and at the planning board level. I see the examples locally happening already. I see in East Hampton Village these oversized houses built by speculators getting variances from the Zoning Board of Appeals to build a garage in the front yard with a basement and a second floor. Now, the Zoning Board of Appeals is supposed to offer exemptions to an applicant from all the rules that all the rest of us have to follow.
For hardships.
For hardships. So where is the developer, where's the hardship for a speculating developer who's building to turn a profit on not being able to build a garage in the front yard with a second floor and a basement? I don't get it. I don't see it. I'm sorry to name names here, but I have to in this regard. Daymarks on 3 Mile Harbor Road, which was a wonderful little deli that we all loved for many decades. Now it's the East Hampton Planning Board and the ZBA gave them variances. They're built too close to the wetlands. Soakhide's Dreen is a historic. That's where the Indians soaked their hides. It looks like the Gowanus Canal now. And the building that's going up looks like a CVS and a strip mall somewhere in suburban America. It's totally inappropriate to the rapidly vanishing rural quality that people treasure out here.
Can we just stop with Soakhides for a second? Because I used to ride my bicycle over there, and I always got my drink at Daymarks. But the other, behind Daymarks, is the trailer park.
Yes.
And it's one of the few trailer parks that I know of in the town of East Hampton. But unfortunately, as the name suggests, people soaked their hides there in old times because it was marshy and almost a swamp.
Yes.
And now you've got good folks who are living there, and there's probably no reasonable way to solve the septic problem.
Yeah.
Which leads me into
why is it there?
Well, it's there.
Predates zoning, number one.
It's there, and obviously you'd like to be able to move people to better, affordable housing. But and I know you don't necessarily want to spend the whole time talking about affordable housing, but the reality is, as you have less and land available for development, you have less and less land available
that is a
for
consequence.
affordable housing.
Absolutely.
And
the land that is available becomes more expensive because there's less of it.
Yeah.
So it exacerbates the housing challenge. I would hope, and I would love to see a townwide symposium on the issue of affordable housing, bringing people together to talk about best practices, things that have worked in other communities, and not all government solutions. There really should be and can be some private solutions. We know I mentioned that John Connors was a local builder. He built lots of affordable housing in East Hampton town in his day, which are many now are rental units, but they're still affordable units. That would be a helpful thing, I think. In terms of septic systems, you bring me, though, to another issue, which water quality is a huge challenge. I am thrilled with the town's low nitrogen initiative. I think it is absolutely one of the most innovative programs I've ever seen to subsidize or offer rebates for individual residences who agree to replace these aging septic systems that are polluting not only our drinking water, but our bays and estuaries and all of our surface waters as well. I think this program is not well publicized. I think it's not really getting off the ground because people don't know about it. They think it's going to happen sometime in the future. They don't realize that there is both a town subsidy of a minimum of $10,000, or up to $10,000, I should say. Actually up to $16,000 in water recharge areas. There's also a parallel county subsidy. So there's a potential of $26,000 rebate to replace an aging septic system with a low nitrogen septic system. This has the potential to really have a positive impact for centuries to come. It's huge.
Yeah. No, the GGG has spent a lot of time on water quality, septic issues, and stuff like that. And there were a couple of things that we thought were and are missing. There's an old 1985 law, I think, where everybody's supposed to get their septic system inspected.
Right.
That hasn't happened.
Not enforced.
And it just seemed to me that you could set this up as a way to get your goal achieved by simply inspecting existing systems, many of which haven't been inspected since they were built or ever. I was going to say for 20 or 30 years. And, and then you have a big Excel spreadsheet. And everybody who's a qualified septic operator could be an inspector. You can't hire people in the town to go out and inspect 21,000 septic systems. And if Joe, septic inspector, or Joe's septic company, finds your house has got a defective system, it goes on on what I'll call an Excel spreadsheet or a big board. And you've got a couple of years to get that fixed. And then you start getting fined if you don't. And you don't have to use Joe and Joe's company. You've got a half a dozen or a dozen qualified, certified contractors who can do this.
Yeah.
And every time I've suggested this, I've gotten sort of a pat on the head and been told this is very complicated. Well, I don't know if this is the right number, but if you're going to spend something in the neighborhood of $500 million to $600 million on septic improvements over the next decade, you've got to have something which is organized and tells you where the problems are, how they're being fixed, when they're being fixed, if they're being fixed, and start having some procedures to get this done. And this, to me, is one of the big deficits of this, of what we have right now.
I think that the town wanted to try the voluntary method first, and give that a chance. And I think if that does not work, and
but you're saying it's not working.
Well, it's new. It's new though,
yeah.
And I think the more we talk about it, the more people who learn about it, the more it will be investigated and utilized.
Yeah, but sometimes these things that are good for people aren't necessarily things that people care about. I'm looking at the Wainscott water problem, and I was just at an airport meeting with Jeff Bragman. We asked him how many people were taking advantage of the $25,000 or $30,000 that you could get to put in a home filtration system. And he said, unfortunately, very few. And so people are still taking their showers in what could be polluted water. They're getting water bottles delivered, and they're not getting.
We have a fire training station right down the road here as well. I wonder if anybody has asked them if they're still using that.
We don't ask too many questions. But I think the answer is, or at least the challenge is, how to accelerate this focus, compliance.
Yes.
And I'm thinking about,
compliance in your own self-interest.
In your own self-interest. When we did our panel discussions on septic waste, we found there was a guy who had a very multi-million-dollar house on Georgia Pond and didn't realize he had a septic tank.
Yeah.
And didn't realize his well was in the wrong position.
Right.
So God knows what he's been drinking for.
Right.
But here's a guy
How's the state of his health?
He coughs a lot. But here's a guy who had more than enough money on a quick telephone call to get this whole system replaced. And yet the publicity hadn't yet reached him. Maybe if he had somebody inspecting the septic system that he didn't know he had and getting notices without even waiting for the town's subsidy, he'd go out and, I can't imagine he wouldn't do it. So I think there are a lot of ways to speed this process up.
Well, I suspect that if this project does not take off and people don't start taking advantage of it, that will be the next step to move to something like that.
But
I think local government is always reluctant to use enforcement if incentive will work. So they're like to try they're trying incentive first,
Well,
and if that doesn't work, then I think we will move to enforcement.
well, in terms of incentives, if, again, I'm using this guy, but there are many others who I spoke to. I could probably tell you that 30 or 40% of the people I know didn't know they had a septic system. And they didn't know that it wouldn't last forever, and they didn't know where it was. So if you don't start with at least mandatory
Nobody
inspections,
knows where it is unless
nobody
there's
knows.
trouble.
The guy with the metal pole bangs around until he finds it. But even if you don't want to start fining people for not upgrading, I think you could at least start a program that's coherent to have everything inspected so you know what the situation is, and the homeowner knows, because it's pretty easy to be blind to issues like this. If you have a wedding and the septic system overflows during the wedding,
It gets your attention.
It gets your attention.
Yes.
But other than that,
It's easy to forget
it's,
about it.
it's easy to forget. But so we've touched upon housing
But once again,
initiatives.
East Hampton Town is light years ahead of every other town on Long Island on this issue.
That's what scares me.
Well, you should be scared. I mean, we're not good citizens of this planet, Arthur. We're not doing a good job of taking care of our nest, if you will.
Well, I'm going to invite you right now to be a speaker at our next panel discussion, getting some business people and the government involved, for example, in affordable housing. And I thank you very much for your perspectives, which
Thank
is
you,
just
Arthur.
terrific.
Thank you for your good work.
Okay.
I'm very proud of what you do.
Well, thank you very much.